All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are continuing our year in positional reviews, wrapping up the defense by talking about the Falcons' safety position in 2021, as well as looking ahead to 2022 and whether or not the futures for Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Grant is bright.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans. Of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by the GetUpside app. You can download GetUpside for free, and when you do, use the promo code touchdown to get 25 cents back per gallon in cash back on your first tank. So, guys, today we're talking about the Falcons' safety position, wrapping up the defense in our positional year in reviews. We've gone through all the offense, we've gone through most of the defense, with the safety left to be discussed. And of course, we have the special teams, which is probably coming next week. We have to clear the runway to get a whole week of special teams content here on Locked On Falcons podcast because you know it matters. But today we're going to be talking about the safeties. We'll talk about how the veterans like Duron Harmon, Shawn Williams, and Erik Harris performed. We'll be taking a deeper look at Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Grant and whether or not those guys are the potential solutions at the safety position in the future. And we'll talk about what potential offseason moves the Falcons may make at that group. But before we get into all of that, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including on Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, now free and available on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like when you do. So let's jump in. Let's talk a little bit about the veterans that the Falcons signed this offseason with Duron Harmon, Erik Harris, and Shawn Williams. And, you know, it's funny because if you go back to last offseason, you know, like 9 or so months ago, and you had asked me going into the season about this group of veterans, I would have been pretty optimistic about Duron Harmon potentially providing a Ricardo Allen-esque stability on the back end. And meanwhile, I was a lot more concerned about whether Erik Harris could hold up as a starter and potentially be a liability. And while Harmon did kind of look reminiscent of Ricardo Allen at times this past year, it was more reminiscent of the version of Ricardo Allen that we saw in 2020 that was not very good and was generally a non-factor, or at least a non-positive factor in the defense. And meanwhile, I think Harris did more to remind me of the previous incarnations of Ricardo Allen, especially that 2019 Ricardo Allen, which I thought was Rico's best season here in Atlanta. And those of you that don't recall, that was the season where, you know, Keanu Neal got hurt for the second time in a row, and the Falcons were kind of forced to have to modify Ricardo Allen's role within the defense, and he had to wear many hats. Sometimes he was a strong safety and a box defender. Sometimes he was covering tight ends. Sometimes he was covering running backs and receivers out of the slot. And while Allen did get exposed a couple of times, particularly against some of those more athletic tight ends like George Kittle and Jerry Cook in the second half of that season, I thought for the most part he handled his job pretty well, handling the bulk of those sort of ever-changing assignments. And that's why in 2019, I named Ricardo Allen as my defensive player of the year after, of course, Grady Jarrett being who was my overall team MVP that season, given how well I thought, you know, Ricardo Allen really improved and adjusted that specific season. And I felt like Erik Harris this past season was kind of a poor man's version of that. Not quite as good as Rico was in that 2019 season, but similarly was asked to do many things, whether I was playing deep in the two high coverages that the Falcons featured, sometimes playing the slot as their nickel, manning up tight ends at various times, being a box run defender. And I thought for the most part, Harris did all of those things pretty competently. And it was rare when I watched the All 22 this season where I saw him out of position or thought he made a mental error or all those sort of things. And I thought Erik Harris really embodied the quote unquote do your job mantra that we constantly talk about, that sort of Dean Pease is trying to instill in this defense. And that really wasn't the case with Duron Harmon, who was a guy that I often saw out of position. I felt like he got better in the second half of the season, but only slightly so. And I think part of the reasons why Duron Harmon just didn't seem to work, even though, again, going back to those all-season expectations and looking at his body of work and seeing a much better player over the course of, whatever it was, like 7 or 8 years in the NFL than what Erik Harris was over the previous, like 4 or 5. I think some of that is owed to the possibility that Harmon wasn't a great fit in the sort of the Falcons defense because of their frequent usage of those split safety and cover two sort of coverages. Because when you go back and you look at Harmon's career, whether that was in New England or Detroit, for the most part, he was predominantly used as a single high safety. And for whatever reason, it just didn't necessarily translate to him being effective in the Dean Pease scheme this past season. And, one of the issues that I noticed with Duron Harmon was he was very prevalent in giving up big plays, particularly when the Falcons, were playing that cover two. I said on the linebacker episode where Foye Oluokun gave up the most big plays in terms of my charting on defense this past year, with 9 overall, and I think 7 of those came in cover two. I think Fabian Moreau also gave up 9 this year, but a lot of those were in man coverage and other coverages. But in that cover two, Duron Harmon was right behind those guys with like 5 20-plus yard plays that he had given up when the Falcons deployed their cover two. So when you look at both of these guys that were the starters for the Falcons at safety, they're both free agents in Harris and Harmon. And I figure if one of these guys is going to be back, Harris, would be the player that you would like to bring back just because he had the much better season. And then you look at the other safety veteran that the Falcons have in Shawn Williams, who's also poised to hit free agency, who got a lot of action late in the year, in part due to Harris's torn pectoral injury. And I thought similarly showed some versatility comparable to what we talked about earlier with Erik Harris. And I thought did a pretty solid job sort of filling in for those last couple of games. And you could certainly make the case that of these three, maybe Williams is the guy that you prefer to have back just because he's not coming off that injury like Harris potentially is. But I think sort of maybe splitting the difference between them, what you look at is maybe that Harris has a little bit of a stronger special teams background. Now, Williams has spent time playing special teams over the course of his career, but several of those years where he was a starter in Cincinnati, he did not play special teams, and that was not necessarily the case with Erik Harris, as he has been a regular contributor on special teams throughout his career. And in fact, this past season in Atlanta was really the first year where he was not a regular on special teams week in and week out. So I feel like you can bring back both of those guys to provide some depth and some veteran leadership and really give you sort of an insurance policy in the event that some of your young guys like Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Graham, who we're going to talk about coming up on today's episode, don't necessarily show the progress because you kind of know what Harris and Williams can provide. And, push comes to shove, maybe you have them competing for one roster spot. If that's the case, and you wouldn't feel too bad about moving on from one of those guys, since both guys on the the quote unquote wrong side of 30 or whatever the case may be. And I think should be relatively cheap guys to keep. You can probably sign them to 1-year contracts for worth $1 million, $1.5 million, somewhere in that range, and feel like you could be able to get both of those guys. I don't see necessarily either one of them having great markets, in part due to their age and the limited playing time that they had this past season. So we'll see if the Falcons are sort of thinking along those same lines as me in that regard. But, I think, if this safety group is going to make significant strides between now and the 2022 season is probably not going to rest on the shoulders of guys like Erik Harris, Shawn Williams, or Duron Harmon. It's going to rest on the shoulders of guys like Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Grant, who we're going to talk about coming up next on today's episode. But before we get there, guys, I do want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. As usual, I always have plugs for what your second listen should be. And of course, today, let's talk about the Locked On Braves podcast, where you can get your daily dose of Atlanta Braves offseason content. Find out what's going on with my cousin Freddie, the latest with him on the Locked On Braves podcast, available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find the Locked On Falcons podcast, including on YouTube. So we know that BetOnline has had you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football continues its march towards the big game in just a few days. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this offseason. I noticed that BetOnline.net even has mock drafts now. And if you're wondering what the line is for that big game on Sunday, it moved back in the Rams' favor after they were moved back from the Rams' favor, where the Rams were previously 4.5-point favorites. Now they're only 4-point favorites, which is where the line opened up with the Rams versus the Bengals. But it's not just football. It's BetOnline allows you to bet on pro, college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, and all your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline, where the game starts. So let's start off today's conversation about these two young up-and-coming safeties with the less polarizing player. Let's talk about Jaylinn Hawkins. And I thought Jaylinn Hawkins played particularly well in the first half of the season. And back during the part of the year where the Falcons were struggling to generate turnovers, he had some key ones with a pair of interceptions in the Jets and Dolphins games. And that early success, I think, led to a lot of people calling for Jaylinn Hawkins to start over guys like Harris and Harmon due to some of the ups and downs that both of those guys had in the early part of the season. And we didn't necessarily get to see Jaylinn Hawkins earn that starting spot immediately after that because he was dealing with some injuries and whatnot. But we did get to see him get an extended look during a 3-game stretch starting in week 14, where Erik Harris went down with that pectoral injury. And frankly speaking, I wasn't that impressed with Jaylinn Hawkins during that 3-game stretch. It felt like during that stretch of times, while he didn't play poorly, it just felt like there were a few too many mental errors, a few too many blown assignments. And so therefore it felt like kind of retroactively justifying sort of Dean Pease's decision to make Jaylinn Hawkins more of the third safety that was playing, say, roughly 50% of the snaps during the first half of the season versus being the guy that a lot of people wanted him to be, which is, a full-time starter playing 100% of the snaps. And while I do think Jaylinn Hawkins potentially does represent a higher upside than guys like Harmon and Harris does, showing a little bit more of that playmaking instincts, I think if he can eliminate some of those mental errors, I think there's real potential that he could be a solid upgrade for the Falcons in 2022. But right now I'm kind of in wait and see mode with Jaylinn Hawkins to see if he can, live up to that. We know that he's a capable third safety. He's a capable role player in that regard. But whether he can be consistently more than that remains to be seen. But seriously, the upside is there. And we'll just sort of have to see if he can deliver on that. And what's interesting about Jaylinn Hawkins is, if you ask me sort of what is his ideal role in this defense moving forward, I don't know, because I look at him from his days at Cal, where they played a lot of two high looks, and he played a lot of sort of single high in that role, which would make you think that he's a pretty good fit in this defense and showing that versatility in the deep coverages that Dean Pease likes to deploy. But if you guys recall in my scouting report of him, I didn't think he was that good at that, or at least, enough to really think that he could excel at that at the NFL level like you would want in a potential starter. But because of that, I kind of had low expectations for Jaylinn Hawkins and thought of him as more of a kind of an undersized box safety that could be a decent backup for Keanu Neal and be a guy capable of being able to step in for, a handful of games as a replacement starter if you need be, and be decent in that role. But to be honest with you, I think he's outperformed my expectations. And I feel like he's now in a position to be a competent, if not good, starter. And that's, basically the potential. He's already kind of reached where his ceiling, I thought he was coming into the league, and he has the potential to do more. And so we'll just sort of have to see if he can live up to that. So I'm very curious to see what Jaylinn Hawkins is, this season. Does he sort of just stay at where he is right now, or does he continue to ascend? And we'll just sort of have to see. Now, let's talk about the more polarizing player in Richie Grant. And similarly to how I am with Jaylinn Hawkins, I'm in wait and see mode with Richie Grant. Now, obviously, Richie Grant got off to a bit of a slow start this season. We had expectations going into the summer and going into the season that he would wind up, earning one of the starting safety spots, particularly the one opposite Duron Harmon, and he didn't quite live up to that. In the first month of the season, he saw almost no action on defense. It really wasn't until Isaiah Oliver's injury in that Week 4 game against the Giants where we started to see Richie Grant get a lot more playing time and snaps after that point, and it was primarily as the sort of one of many options that the Falcons had trying to replace Isaiah Oliver, one of three rookies, with Avery Williams and Darren Hall being the other two guys filling in that nickel cornerback spot. And I do think Richie Grant did perform better than both of those guys. And so that, leads to a lot more conversation about Richie Grant. And we'll, I'll save it from getting too much into the weeds about the details of what, why he wasn't playing this much and why he wasn't getting snaps at safety. I'll leave that to other people to spend their time speculating about. But what I will say on that is I do feel like people probably spend too much time and energy trying to figure out why Richie Grant wasn't playing this year and trying to interpret, what he was based off of a lot of things that I don't think are really that consequential. For me, I'm a guy that just looks at the film and I evaluate the player I see on the field and try not to figure out too much of that other stuff in terms of going into my process. But, I thought early in the season when he was getting some of those snaps, in that second quarter, I guess you could call, of the season after Oliver's injury, I do feel like he did suffer from some mental errors. And that sort of spoke to maybe some of the concerns that Dean Pease had that he was expressing about his comfort within the scheme. But I felt like after a certain point, I can't tell you exactly when that point was, I felt like it was no longer mental issues or whatever, breakdowns in the assignments that really plagued Richie Grant. The only real issue I had with his play in the second half of the season was he had too many missed tackles. And, this is part of the conversation when it comes to Richie Grant. And this is part of the reason why I'm a film snob, because I watch the film and I see sort of what he is on the film, and I don't worry about the other stuff that much. And I think a lot of other people that, whether professionally or as a hobby, give their opinions about the Falcons online and other places because they're not regularly watching film. They tend to focus a little bit more on the box scores and the snap counts and who's active and inactive and what is Dean Pease saying in his press conference, because they don't have the confidence or whatever to sit down and watch the film and form their own opinions. And so for me, at least, I think when you look at all that extra stuff, I feel like people kind of need to relax. I think it's certainly fair to say that he had a disappointing rookie season. I think he had a disappointing rookie season, certainly based off of my preseason expectations. And I go back to a comment I made in August during the preseason where I was concerned about Richie Grant not necessarily winning a starting job. And that was a red flag to me at the time, because when I look back at the previous decade of Falcons second round picks and you looked at the guys that did play as rookies like Deion Jones and Robert Alford, they went on to have success. But then when you looked at the guys that didn't necessarily play that much as rookies, at least early in their rookie seasons, like Isaiah Oliver and Jalen Collins and Rashid Hageman and Peter Kahns, those guys did not necessarily go on to have success. And at that point in time, we didn't know enough about Marlon Davidson. But so far, with another year under his belt, again, another guy that didn't play a whole lot as a rookie, doesn't necessarily look like he's going to go on and have a stellar career. And that was a concern for me, where it's like, if Richie Grant isn't necessarily playing, does he fall into that other category of guys? And certainly that's still a concern for a lot of people sitting here today. But it's notable that if you went back beyond a decade, you would find another player, a safety, in fact, that the Falcons drafted in 2009 in the second round that did not play that much as a rookie, and part of that was owed to injuries. But he only played 2 games, and that player, of course, I'm talking about is Willie Moe, and he went on to have an excellent career, and is one of the better safeties that the Falcons have had over the last 2 or more decades. So I look at that and say, like, you can't necessarily write it off. And then when you look even, around further, you see several other safeties that had success in Atlanta, like Thomas Deku and Ricardo Allen, that also did not play really at all their rookie season. Thomas Deku had 0 snaps on defense and just played special teams his rookie season. And we know Ricardo Allen was the same. Obviously, Ricardo Allen came to Atlanta as a cornerback, but spent his rookie season on the practice squad. And again, both of those guys went on to be successful starters here in Atlanta for multiple years, including earning Pro Bowl spots. And so I mentioned Deku as a potential outcome even back in that episode back in August, whenever that was, where I was talking about Richie Grant and my concerns about it. And I was saying, okay, well, maybe instead of having these high expectations that he was going to be, this multi Pro Bowl type of player, this Jimmy Ward, Rodney McLeod type of player that I compared him to in my scouting report, maybe he just winds up being Thomas Deku or whatever the case may be. And I know some people hear me compare Richie Grant to Thomas Deku and they think that's a bad outcome. And if you're the type of person that thinks that, that's fine. That's a perfectly valid opinion. But I would look at it and say a guy that started over 90 games across 6+ seasons in the NFL, had 15 career interceptions in a Pro Bowl, is not necessarily a bad outcome for a player like Richie Grant. So if you think that, that's fine. That's a perfectly valid opinion. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad outcome. So when we talk about Richie Grant in his future, could he be better than Thomas Deku? Absolutely. Could he just be Thomas Deku? Sure. Could he be worse than Thomas Deku? Yep, that's all on the table. That's why I'm sort of sitting here in wait and see mode. And I say, my recommendation for everybody else is not to panic about it. Right. It's interesting because my floor comparison for what I thought Richie Grant was coming into the NFL was a guy named Marcus Gilchrist, who was a second-round pick of the San Diego Chargers back in 2011. Gilchrist played cornerback at Clemson. He struggled in that role, playing a nickel cornerback in his first 2 years in San Diego. They ultimately moved him to safety in year 3, and he went on to start the next 6 seasons with the Chargers, with the Jets, with the Texans, with the Raiders, and was a solid safety. And now I look at 9 months later in terms of that comparison with Richie Grant, and I look at the similarities between what Richie Grant's rookie season was and what Marcus Gilchrist's rookie season was, and they're pretty much identical, given that Richie Grant wound up playing primarily as a nickel cornerback. They played roughly the same number of snaps as rookie, roughly 270 snaps. And so obviously when I made that comp at the time with Richie Grant and Marcus Gilchrist, I was more referring to what Marcus Gilchrist was, during the peak of his career when I make those floor and eye level and ceiling comparisons and whatnot than necessarily what Gilchrist was coming into the league. But I just think, again, it's further proof that, year one is not going to necessarily define Richie Grant, nor should it define many players out there. And it's really going to be what you are in year 2, what you are in year 5, what you are in potentially year 10. That's really going to define your football career. And so I would say to anybody out there that's panicking about Richie Grant that you may want to relax. But with all that said, we don't necessarily know what Richie Grant and what Jaylinn Hawkins are going to be. And does that mean the Falcons might be smart to bring in somebody that they do have a better idea about this offseason via the draft or via the free agency to potentially upgrade this position? And we'll talk about that as we continue and wrap up today's Locked On Falcons safety year-end review. But before we get there, guys, I want to remind you that Locked On Podcast Network is all week long been in LA, and they've been covering this big game coming up. And of course, you guys can check out the Locked On Bengals podcast and the Locked On Rams podcast on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So, guys, it's a new year, and a lot of people had New Year's resolutions. But now that we're in February, a lot of people have given up on their New Year's resolutions. And if you're one of those people, I say, sorry to hear that. But, if one of your resolutions was eating healthy, maybe you should have put Built Bars in your plan, and you can do that now. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar. If you want to eat healthy, it can be tough because it gets boring, but Built Bar makes eating healthier fun because it tastes good and you'll want to eat it. Built Bar tastes good. It's good for you. It's low in sugar, calories, and carbs. It's high in protein and fiber. They come in a variety of great flavors. You got eggnog, coconut brownie chunk. You got tried and trues like coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, and so much more. All you got to do in order to get your very own flavor of Built Bar is to head to built.com and use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So today's episode is brought to you by a new app called GetUpside, where you can get cash back with every gallon of gas that you put in your car and save every time you fill up. And there's no catch; it's all free. You can download GetUpside for free in the App Store or on Google Play. And all you have to do to get that cash back is you open the app, you go to one of the thousands of eligible gas stations near you, and you just claim the offer. You fill up your tank. They put money into your account, and you can cash out anytime with direct payments into your bank account. You can use PayPal. You can get gift cards. I like to get mine on Amazon gift cards. And now, when you open a free account on GetUpside and use our special promo code Touchdown, you get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. So don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free GetUpside app and use the promo code Touchdown when you sign up. That's GetUpside, promo code Touchdown, to start saving every time you fill up. So, I pointed this out last offseason when we were talking about the safety group, and I said basically along the lines of, it's rare that you're going to find good defenses in the NFL that don't at least get quality safety play. And last year, I had my hopes and dreams pinned, as we've kind of already touched on, Duron Harmon and Richie Grant providing that we weren't necessarily getting in previous years due to injuries and age and all these various factors. My hope was that those guys, again, probably not going to be world beaters in 2021, but could at least be above average. And that would be a potential sign that this defense could at least be somewhere around league average this year, maybe the 18th best defense in the league. That was kind of my hopes and dreams for this unit. Obviously, we did not get that. And obviously, we didn't get that from either Duron Harmon or Richie Grant. And it remains to be seen if Richie Grant, Duron Harmon, or any of these guys, Jaylinn Hawkins, provide that sort of quality safety play in 2022. So, of course, that begs the question, can the Falcons bring in somebody that can provide that quality safety play this offseason? And even if you do have guys like Hawkins and or Grant step up this upcoming season, we know that Dean Pease likes to play those three safety, those dime looks. And especially given that Grant has shown the flexibility to be able to play some slot corner in those looks, it gives him some added versatility that you could make room for the Falcons adding another safety to this room and potentially upgrading the spot and still feeling comfortable playing, all three of these guys potentially. And it's a pretty strong free agent class in large part due to it being a strong free agent class last year. And a lot of the guys that we talked about potentially adding last year, which of course the Falcons didn't wind up adding any of those guys, signed 1-year deals and sort of are now going to be back on the market. Players that we talked about last offseason, and I'm sure you can go back and listen to one of those free agent Friday episodes that we had in February or whatever the case may be, when we were breaking down the safety group, where we talked about players like Marcus May, Marcus Williams, Anthony Harris, Tashawn Gibson, Xavier Woods, Malik Hooker. All of those guys are back on the market this season after signing 1-year deals, and they'll be joined by other players like Jabril Peppers, Jesse Bates, Rodney McLeod, Jaquaski Tart, Justin Reed, Jordan Whitehead, Jaron Kearse, Tyrann Mathieu, Devin McCourty, Quandre Diggs, and Terrell Edmonds. And I've even heard talk that Eddie Jackson may be on his way out in Chicago and maybe a cap casualty this offseason. So it should be a pretty strong group of safeties, even if some of those guys wind up getting tagged and some of those guys wind up re-signing with their respective teams. So if the Falcons are willing to spend some money, and they weren't in the last year, if they're willing to spend money this offseason because they have a little bit more space than they did a year ago, they sure are certain to find some potential upgrade options if that is the case. And then it'll be interesting because even with all the talent that's flooding the market, I still think there's probably a decent chance that the Falcons won't necessarily have to spend that much money and still be able to find a capable safety. Because again, with all this talent sort of flooding the market potentially, you could probably wait into that second wave of free agency where the money starts to dry up. And we know that usually the first week, 7 to 10 days of free agency is right when the money starts to dry up. And so you can just kind of wait till like day 8 or something like that and see sort of who's out there and still probably get a good solid safety that's a clear upgrade over some of the options that the Falcons have right now for relatively cheap. And that's how Dallas got Malik Hooker last year. That's how the Vikings got Xavier Woods last year. And so the Falcons may be able to use that tactic to not necessarily spend a ton of money and still get a quality safety. Obviously, another option for the Falcons is the draft. I haven't necessarily watched this safety class that much. I've watched Kyle Hamilton out of Notre Dame, the top safety in this draft class. Some people think he's the top player in the entire draft. And thus, you know that if the Falcons employ their best player available strategy and he's there at pick number 8, he would be an obvious option there as the best player available if people think that highly of him. And I wouldn't argue against anybody that does put Kyle Hamilton as number 1 on their draft board. I do think that highly of him, as well as, I think it also is a kind of a reflection on the rest of the draft class. But, I do think he's a really talented player and would certainly be an excellent addition. We won't go too deep on what he would bring to the table on today's episode, because I have the feeling that we'll have many more opportunities to talk about what Kyle Hamilton can bring to the table when we get into some of these mock draft Mondays. We got like 11 of those coming up starting next week between then and the draft. So we might be able to talk a little bit more deeply about Kyle Hamilton and what his specific skill set. But he certainly is a playmaker. And I've talked in the past about, one of the needs I thought the Falcons had is adding another playmaker in the secondary to tag team with AJ Terrell, whether it's a corner, whether it's a safety. Doesn't ultimately matter that much to me. I just think they need another playmaker. And whether it's, I don't know if it's a need so much where it's like a priority or whatever the case may be, but it is certainly a priority want. If you get my drift, like, I don't know if it's necessarily that they have to go out there and get a Kyle Hamilton caliber player or a big time corner or whatever the case may be, but it's certainly something I do think would go a long way to really enhancing the secondary moving forward. The only other guy in the draft class, again, I haven't really done much homework on the safety group, but the only other guy that I've watched enough to comment on is Lewis Seen from Georgia, and he is a striker. That is how I will describe him. Who was it? Was it Deshaun Golton or was it Dante Whitner that was the bigger hitter in San Francisco? I think it was Golton, right? Because Golton, once he left San Francisco and they changed the rules, he couldn't play in the league anymore. He did had a cup of coffee with the Falcons in their Super Bowl run, but whichever one of those two guys, I think Golden's probably the better comp. Like that's kind of what reminds me of Lewis Seen, is at least as a striker. I think there's a potential that he's a better coverage guy than Golden was. But like that's the type of player that, and swagger that he can bring to a secondary. So he would also be a welcome addition to the Falcons secondary, because they certainly don't really have that player right now in their secondary that can be that real enforcer. So he's a guy that could be in the mix. I've seen some people project him as a late first round pick, certainly a potential second round pick. I think makes a lot of sense for him. So someone that could be on the Falcons radar in round 2 or whatever the case may be. So we'll just have to see. I haven't done a deep dive in the safety group in the draft, largely due to the fact that I'm kind of waiting to see if the Falcons sign somebody in free agency and therefore don't necessarily make safety a priority. So that is something that I will probably look at later this offseason as we get closer to free agency and after free agency. Like we get to March 26th and the Falcons haven't made that splash at safety that I hope they made last year, and then, disappoint me again for the second offseason in a row, then I'll start, okay, I need to start looking at these safeties, because it seems likely the Falcons are probably going to add somebody to the safety room rather than just bringing back, Shawn Williams, Erik Harris, and Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Grant. That's not a bad, quartet of safeties, but certainly, you're kind of pinning all your hopes on the jumps that Hawkins and Richie Grant are going to make, and maybe they make those jumps, maybe they don't make those jumps, and so you want to at least bring somebody else in the mix that you can also sort of bet on in that regard in terms of getting better safety play. I think personally this offseason. So I think Harris, Williams, Grant and Hawkins is a good starting point to build your safety group. But I think in free agency in the draft that I would hope that the Falcons can add a little bit more help. So we'll leave it at that, guys, and that will do it for our year-end positional reviews on the defensive side of the ball. Again, of course, we have the special teams, unit coming up, and we'll probably save that till next week, probably on Tuesday or Wednesday. Depending on, if there's other interesting things to discuss. But the rest of the week, we'll sort of leave talking a little bit more about this upcoming Rams-Bengals matchup. We'll have a guest on, I think, tomorrow to talk a little bit about that matchup, a former player that once played in one of these Super Bowls, as well as talk about some other things. And then I think we'll probably also have some opportunity to answer some of your listener questions. I know there's one from last week that someone emailed to me that's related to the Super Bowl from, still not being over, the last Super Bowl that the Falcons were in. And that will allow me to talk a little bit more deeply about that subject on one of those episodes. But if you want to provide your feedback and get your questions answered on either one of the next 2 episodes of Locked On Falcons, of course, you can send in your questions, provide your feedback via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And that's going to do it for us guys here on Locked On Falcons. I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen, but I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, you have Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, and of course, you have Locked On Bets, where handicapping expert Lee Sterling's giving you his daily picks, his blowout specials, and of course, his lock of the day. And of course, I'm sure Lee's got you covered with some great props for this upcoming Super Bowl matchup between the Rams and Bengals on Sunday. So go check out Locked On Bets, free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.